Hi everybody, Bearded Rogue here, and today we're talking wrestling. Specifically, I wanted to record a video that I've been tempted to record in the past, but I've always avoided, and you'll understand why here in just a second. Chris Jericho, on his Talk is Jericho podcast, recently had Dave Meltzer, wrestling historian, wrestling observer, writer, and all-around wrestling super guy on, and he specifically had him on so that they could have a discussion of Chris Benoit's career 10 years later. Anybody who isn't familiar with the Chris Benoit event, over the course of a weekend, he killed his family and himself, it prompted all sorts of investigations into concussions and various other issues. It's totally changed the landscape of wrestling and what moves are allowed to be done. Concussion protocol has become a very big deal. There's no real specific answers as to why anything happened. Like, no note was left, no rationale was left behind, so as an audience we were all just kind of left guessing. And the Monday night after the event happened, they ran a career retrospective Monday Night Raw on Chris Benoit, covering some of his greatest matches of all time and just kind of superseding all other programming. And then they have since excised him from all wrestling history. He doesn't show up on DVDs. You cannot search for him on the WWE Network. His matches are still part of the original broadcasts that they existed on, but you can't actually search directly for him at all. He's not a keyword. He doesn't exist. He's unlikely to ever make it into the Hall of Fame. He's unlikely to ever share any of the accolades that his peers that he came into the business with, Eddie Guerrero, Dean Malenko. He's unlikely to have any kind of lasting legacy beyond the events of that weekend. And he's somebody that people just don't talk about now because what he did was so horrific and such a horrible thing. It's hard to talk about the man without focusing on that. It's been a decade, and while that doesn't make it any better, it has made it a bit easier for people to start mentioning him again, in not entirely unflattering lights. I mean, what he did was absolutely monstrous. Nobody supports it, condones it, nobody really even understands it. I think the WWE's decision is correct, long term, in keeping him out of the Hall of Fame and kind of excising him from their company's history. But for people who were wrestling fans during that time, who grew up during the era where the transition from the lumbering dinosaurs of the old school WWE happened, where we moved away from them to the Dean Malenkos, the Eddie Guerreros, the Chris Jerichos, the Chris Benoits, the Rey Mysterios, the smaller, more agile wrestlers like what we see today. You know, Daniel Bryan, Seth Rollins, Sami Zayn, Finn Balor, all of these guys could, their careers could directly be traced back to the path that these guys forged, and Chris Benoit was a huge part of that. And Chris Benoit, probably one of my favorite wrestlers of all time. He wasn't great on the mic. He wasn't the worst on the mic ever, but he was best when he wasn't saying anything. When he was just coming out there and talking with action. He had some of the most crisp offense I've ever seen in my life. His suplexes were just on the money. He never filled his match with a lot of rest holds. He was always kind of filling his match with what he liked to jokingly call meat and potatoes, which is kicks and punches and offense like that looks like offense rather than, you know, a boring headlock, but isn't very damaging for the wrestler to do or for the other wrestler to take. His suicide dives, his tope suicida was unbelievably good. He had some of the best offense ever. Like, his finishing move, the crippler crossface, is still used to this day. It's such an innovative, great looking move. Like, it highlights both the wrestlers' faces, allows you to see both the person who's in the hold and the wrestler who's applying the hold's face at the same time in the same camera shot. You don't have to cut back and forth. It looks like it hurts. I'm sure in real life it could be made to hurt. And he was totally plausible. Possibly the best chops in the business as well, like ever. Ric Flair made chops famous. Chris Benoit made chops hurt. It was totally plausible to see him doing what he was doing. And he was smaller than other guys. Like, he was not the tallest guy out there. I don't know that he was even 6 foot, but he was ripped. Like, absolutely ripped. He'd come out there just, like, you could tell that this guy spent so much time perfecting his craft, perfecting his form, and that his form was functional. Like, all of his strength was functional strength. He just looked like a badass. Missing teeth, didn't care, like, he just looked hard. He looked like a very hard man. And from my understanding, he was a very shy man and a very gruff man and someone who was very hard to get to know. And all of those things carried on all the way through his unfortunate end and his horrible crimes. But to somebody who's always been smaller, I'm 5'3". Chris was bigger than me by far, but as somebody who's always been a smaller guy, like, seeing him get over on the Triple H's and the Randy Ortons and the other large chosen people really spoke to me. Like, here was somebody who didn't have the ideal WWE form or body, who worked his ass off to make himself one of the best technical wrestlers on the planet, and one of the most believable competitors on the planet. I remember WrestleMania 20, him winning the title in a triple threat match with Shawn Michaels and Triple H, like, two of the biggest names in the world. And everybody had just kind of written Chris off. And this was like the culmination. If you've ever watched Max Landis's Wrestling Isn't Wrestling, this is the culmination of Triple H's run as, the guy who never quite made it, which is so funny to say that with him being as dominant as he was for as long as he was. But, like, here's him taking his eye off the ball and focusing on Shawn Michaels, and this upstart, this, smaller guy who fights with such intensity, comes in and snatches the championship away. And it was such an amazing feel-good moment. Like, seeing Benoit win the championship for me was huge. That was my Daniel Bryan wins the championship moment. That happened 10 years later at WrestleMania 30. Here's the little guy that they said couldn't make it, who made it on hard work and determination and just being better than everybody else. Like, he didn't have bad matches. I can't remember a bad Chris Benoit match. There were a lot of times, especially once he got to the WWE, where he didn't have a lot of time. In WCW, he was in the Cruiserweight division, which really hampered some of his stuff until the Cruiserweight division took off. But he just didn't have bad matches. It didn't matter whether it was some blow-off filler match or a pay-per-view match. You were going to get your money's worth when he was in the ring. And still to this day, he's one of my favorites of all time. And it makes me really sad because I can't bring myself to watch his matches. It's so weird how one weekend can totally change everything. But here's this guy who, for the entire time I watched his career, I was totally in love with the Rabid Wolverine, like this little Canadian fire plug with missing teeth and an angry snarl who'd go into the ring and manhandle people who were larger than him. Like, it's exactly the kind of wrestler that appeals to me, exactly the kind of person that I want to see, and I can't watch it anymore. And hearing Jericho and Meltzer talk about it, you know, a lot of Jericho's career was wrestling Chris Benoit. And those are matches he can't put on his DVDs. Those are matches that just don't get seen anymore. Like, they had a hellacious ladder match. Like, absolutely unbelievably good ladder match. Where Jericho put him in the walls of Jericho over the top of the ladder. And it was like a spot that had just never been done before. You know, they just... It's a shame that somebody who I know influenced a lot of the styles that people enjoy now will not be remembered. It's unfortunate that somebody whose body of work was as good as his won't have that shared, or won't have that out there in the world as part of his legacy. His legacy is always going to be that weekend, and it's horrible. It's horrible on every level. Like, he didn't just kill himself and his family, but his entire past. And it's a tragedy, and it's one I don't think that the wrestling world really has recovered from. You know, he's the Voldemort of the wrestling world. People don't talk about him. People don't invoke his name. Even, you know, even people who at the time were huge fans can't do it. You know, Dave Meltzer watches thousands of matches a year, and he's watched one Chris Benoit match since the incident. And it was an accident. Like, he accidentally started watching the match and just finished it because it was that good. And, like, I don't know. I don't know. It's a part of my wrestling childhood that I grew up with. I say childhood, but, like, for a lot of his career, I was already an adult. Like, through, you know, through high school and everything. You know, I was 26 when the incident happened. So, you know, there was a good decade of my wrestling, my career as a wrestling fan, wherein Chris Benoit was one of my favorites, and that is just kind of gone now. It's kind of like ashes in my mouth, and it's unfortunate because it used to be magical for me to watch him, and I guess that's it. Like, I wanted to talk about Chris Benoit because I've wanted to talk about Chris Benoit for a while. It's something that I don't think I've ever really processed, and I think most people feel that way. They just kind of have swept it under the rug and hope that time will make it go away. But I heard this podcast and I just had to say something, because for me it was a huge deal. Like, I remember that night they, you know, started Monday Night Raw with the announcement that he was dead. Like, he was supposed to wrestle at a pay-per-view for the ECW title that Sunday. Like, he was supposed to be the champion. Like, they substituted John Morrison in for him, who then beat CM Punk. Like, here was the two hottest people in my mind ever at the time: young upstart CM Punk, fresh to ECW, and, you know, Chris Benoit, this established main event super talent that I'd been following for years. We're going to wrestle for the ECW title, and then it just didn't happen. And they didn't explain anything, and then Monday night they started with the traditional image in memoriam and the fade to black, and then the whole thing was just Chris Benoit matches, and I watched every single second of it, and I didn't realize at the time that it would be the last time I would see any Chris Benoit matches. So yeah, so that's Chris Benoit. I'm sorry, it's kind of a downer. The whole situation is kind of a downer, but it's something that I've been wanting to talk about for a long time, so thanks, guys, for listening if you did. And Bearded Rogue out.